Hello, YouTube. I meant to post a video a while ago, but when I recorded it and tried to upload it, it was like 40 minutes long. And I don't know if it's my Wi-Fi connection. I don't know what it is, but it didn't work. So the good news is I'm going to try and make this one a lot shorter so that it uploads easier. So it should be a little bit or a good bit easier to watch and to consume. That being said, what this video is about is the main theme of what the Old Testament describes, or the historical main themes, and looking into what does archaeology say more probably happened or didn't happen. And the reason why I'm making this video is not to debunk the Old Testament. It is not to serve as some sort of gotcha. It's not questions that Old Testament scholars who believe in the validity of the Old Testament can't answer. It's really more of, if you're someone who has been minding your own business and being a good person of faith, evangelical, and you've not been paying attention, and you just read the Old Testament and you think that yep, that's exactly what happened. If you're happy with that, that's fine. But the truth, the archaeological record indicates that that's not what happened. And I know a lot of people in the faith community like to say, well, there's a lot of proof for things that happened in the Bible. A very famous example being the Hittites were mentioned in the Bible, and for a long time, scholars didn't think that the Hittites were a true people group. And they said, well, look, here's an example of the Bible talking about a people group that didn't exist. We've since discovered the Hittites, and they actually were a true people group to exist. So some people, some Bible people, Bible-believing people, use that as proof that everything else that the Old Testament claims to be true, therefore must be true, and that's not a good argument. Any more so than maybe the religious annals or texts of the Assyrians or the Babylonians, while they talk about how their gods helped their king conquer some foreign people group, they also get some things historically accurate, some things mentioned timely. Like one thing that we look at is the Assyrian description of the conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel. Their description is what historians go with for how the city was sacked and how the people were carried off, etc. But they don't do that because they believe that Ashur, the god of the Assyrians, actually handed that city over to him because he was his chosen king. They use the historical text when it's historically relevant, and when it's not, or when it talks about religious things, they kind of discard those. So what are some of the things that are historically questionable from the Old Testament? And those things are the account of the Exodus, the account of the conquest of Canaan, the account of the Davidic dynasty, and there being one dynasty, at least initially, that ruled over all of Israel and Judah, the account of the true faith of the Israelites and the Hebrews being initially monotheistic and then being distorted or perverted due to the failure of the Israelites to expel all the Canaanites. Those are kind of some of the big main theme elements, historical elements that archaeology can give us some insight into. So the first one being the story of the Exodus. While it's historically accurate that Canaanites, people from Canaan, did go down and live in Egypt, and in fact, at one point, I want to say around 1400 BC, they established their own pharaoh over Egypt. They were so numerous that they conquered the Egyptians and established their own dynasty of external foreign rulers in Egypt for a couple of decades before they were kicked out again. So yes, Canaanites did in fact travel back and forth, live in Egypt, etc. However, the account of there being, according to the Bible, 600,000 fighting age men alone, so closer to 2 million men, women, children, and elderly, exiting through the Exodus and going back to Canaan, their distant homeland, after 400 years, is not supported. There would be, especially when you read about what the camps, in the Bible, what the camps were supposed to have been like, there would have been some archaeological record, even if it was just waste, piles of waste, dug up earthenworks for defensive structures, etc. There would be indication that 2 million people walked across the Sinai Desert and resided there for 40 years, especially considering that in some of those places they were stopped for over for several decades. So there would have been an accumulation of waste that would have been archaeologically significant and discoverable. Not to mention that the historical record also indicates that the Israelites, the Hebrews, were not very distantly related to the Canaanites. Instead, they were closely related, similar material culture, similar linguistically. And you say, well, but we all know that they're Canaanites, that they just came down. Well, 400 years in a foreign country, according to the Bible, would be a significant amount of time, and we would expect there to be bigger differences in their material culture, in their language, etc., and in their pantheon of gods even. So the story of the Exodus, as described in the Bible, is unlikely. Modern day archaeologists from Israel who have a vested interest in finding support for their own ancestral lineage in the land of Israel, even they struggle to say, yes, the Exodus happened as according to the Bible. What the ones that even still believe, the few that still believe in Exodus of sorts happened, they tend to believe something a little bit more like some contingent of Canaanites that had resided in Egypt for a while, for maybe a few generations, returned back to Canaan, and when they did, they brought back some different worldviews that were taken up and considered popular and influenced faith, influenced societal structure, etc. And the best argument I've heard is that they could have been the Levites, the priestly class, because the Levites, as you read their names in the Bible, the ones that are mentioned by name, they actually are they're Egyptian-sounding names, and so it seems plausible to me that people who came from, at that time, the premier empire in the world, if they came back, it would have almost been like if you lived in a rural area and a group of people moved back from an intellectual or educated area and were considered more civilized than maybe your rural hometown. And so while some of the things that they brought back you might question, or you might be skeptical of, at the end of the day, you would still think that they probably had some sort of tapped in understanding what learned men and women of the powerful empire of the day would have known, and they probably would have had some influence and some sway. So I think that there's probably room for that to be considered true. The next is the conquest of Canaan. The truth, so the book of Joshua describes the cities that were sacked, the order in which they were sacked, etc. And the truth is that the archaeological record has found that many of the cities described in that book and the book of Joshua, they did experience, some of them experienced actually no signs of a violent sacking and destruction, while even the ones that did show signs of destruction, they don't all agree that the dates or the layer of the sediment where the burn layer exists, they're not at the same time. So in other words, it's not like whenever they dig up these cities, they find that between 1250 and 1200 BC, they all were burned to the ground. It's really more like one of them might have been burned to the ground in 1400 BC, one of them might have been burned to the ground in 1100, one of them in 13, etc. So in other words, unless we're supposed to read the conquest according to Joshua with a little bit of liberty, like maybe we read the description of the creation of the earth and we say, well, maybe a day to God was millions of years or something like that. And so maybe when Joshua says we did this in 1 year, maybe he really means a couple. I think that's stretching what the author of the book of Joshua, or the authors of the book of Joshua, meant when they wrote it down. So there's not really proof that there was a complete conquest of Canaan or Canaanite cities, and the ones that are listed explicitly by name, the archaeological record completely refutes that story. The next is the concept of the dynasty, the Davidic dynasty, and more importantly, because they can't prove or find any sort of argument of proof that David actually existed, certainly not that he existed as depicted in the Bible. That's not necessarily damning in and of itself, I mean, it's possible that there was some sort of ancient king, and there just wasn't a really good historical record at the time that he was supposed to exist, but people still knew enough about him. The problem is that many of the things ascribed to him and believed to have happened under David and later Solomon, things such as famous reconstruction works of the defensive works of cities, gates and walls, and storehouses for chariots and horses of war, etc., were all discovered to have happened much later than, at least 1 century after the time that Solomon was supposed to have lived, and happened under other kings who were mentioned by name. So the narrative that there was, in fact, at a point in time where all of Israel and Judah were united under one dynasty that was led from Jerusalem has not been supported. And Israel Finkelstein, a very famous archaeologist who's excavated in and around what's called the City of David in Jerusalem, has indicated that at best they can put some structures around the 10th or 11th century, but that arguing and showing archaeologically that Jerusalem was the central power city in Israel and Judah at the time, they can't. There were many other cities in Israel that were much more powerful and influential, sizable, larger, and therefore more powerful. So that doesn't seem to line up. The southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, is called the House of David, in a stele that was found. But as it's mentioned, I think it's indicative of the argument that the people of Judah considered themselves to be descendants of someone named David. And so I think that you could argue David was some sort of historical figure, but the evidence that David was the David as described in Samuel, for example, 1st and 2nd Samuel, I don't think that you certainly can't support that archaeologically, which may not be a problem for you, but I think more so you can actually disprove, especially when you start talking about Solomon and the things that he supposedly built that just were not actually constructed in the time that Solomon was supposed to have lived. I think, if anything, it disproves that overall narrative of there being one united, happy kingdom that God chose to bless through the dynasty of David. I think the archaeological record indicates that Judah and Israel may have never been a united kingdom. The next concept that I wanted to talk about was that the initial faith of the Hebrews was monotheistic, and it was perverted due to people being, stubborn and sinful, as is depicted in the Bible. And I think, if anything, again, the archaeological record indicates that in most cities where they dug up temples in Israel, which temples weren't supposed to be anywhere but in Jerusalem, but when they dug up temples, they found that they had in their Holy of Holies, so their temples were built actually on the same layout as the temple in Jerusalem was theoretically built, with an outer courtyard, an inner courtyard, and then inside of the inner area there was the Holy of Holies, where the priest would go in once a year and commune with God. And what they found in multiple Holy of Holies in different temples in different cities in ancient Israel was that there were areas erected not just to one God, but that there were 2 and sometimes 3 sacred stones in there that were carved or supposed to depict or represent Yahweh, his wife Asherah, and their son Baal. And Asherah her name is she's mentioned a few times, and she's usually referred to as like the Asherah tree. And I don't want to go into in the Bible, and I don't want to go into why that is. You can look at some of the things I'm going to put down in the links and down in the comment section on this for you to do your own research. But I guess my point is that the historical record indicates, more likely based off of evidence from other similar areas in the Middle East at the time, that more than likely the Canaanites were polytheists, believed in a pantheon of gods, chief of which was Yahweh and his wife and their son. And that only later, closer to maybe the 8th through the 6th centuries BC, do we see what I would almost call like the cult of Yahweh. And I would liken it to places in ancient Sumeria or places in Egypt where they had a full pantheon of gods, but either certain political entities, certain city-states would venerate or worship one god over the others and say, yeah, all the other gods exist, but we worship, for example, Athena in Athens. We worship her as our patron deity. And so I think you could probably think of the beginnings of monotheism in ancient Israel as probably, I think it's more accurate to think of it that way, where there was a cult of Yahweh belief in Jerusalem, and as the rest of Israel and even more prominent cities in Judah waned in power and Jerusalem became the power center, well, they're the ones who lived longest to write the history. And so they were able to go and rewrite the history and indicate that, well, it had always been Yahweh alone, who called us up out of the desert, who called Abraham up out of ancient Sumer, who called us from Egypt and brought us here. But I think that the archaeological record indicates that initially, and not even just initially, but for the majority of the history of the Israelites, if you could jump in a time machine and go back, you would find that they were polytheists. And I think that that's probably, honestly, not even untrue, or not even true just of the ones who were quote unquote the sinful Israelites. So the Bible does a good job with Elijah and Elisha battling the prophets of Baal, etc. So you can either take it at face value that there were many Israelites who had gone astray and were wicked, but the core ones, the real Israelites, were always monotheistic and worshiped Yahweh. I think that if you went back in time, you would find that the cult of Yahweh was probably a much later interpretation of the pantheon, and that there probably was no temple in ancient Israel or ancient Judah that only had worship for Yahweh in place, and that they viewed the others as heathens and outsiders and people who had been misled by the other Canaanites. So what's left to propose, so I've kind of said what the archaeological record indicates is wrong, or not substantiated in the Old Testament. So I would offer what I think is probably more likely what happened. And I only offer this because I think if you tear something down, you should try to put something back in its place. And again, I could be wrong on certain parts of this, but I think if you do your research according to the links I did below, I think you'll find that this is at least a valid interpretation, while not necessarily something that'll be verifiably a true interpretation. So I think it's more likely that the Israelites were a branch of the Canaanites. They lived in the hill country. I think there's a lot of evidence in Middle Eastern culture, in Sumeria, in and around the Hittite Empire, that even when people were, either distantly or closely related to the people that lived up in the hills, if they lived in the city, the people of the hills were always kind of portrayed as wild and savage and dangerous, even though in all reality they might have been very culturally aligned in terms of what their pantheon was, and what their social practices were, and religious festivals that they celebrated. The people of the city were always fearful of the people in the mountains, and that's because the people of the cities, whenever they went through a time of decline, people from the mountains could come down and raid and plunder and take stuff back up to the mountains and then continue to reside. And so what you also find is that whenever you went through a period of decline, and the Bronze Age collapse is a great example, the people that came down from the mountains were typically able to impose their will because they had a more rugged structure, and they didn't depend on the very connected economy that existed in Bronze Age, in the Bronze Age Middle East, or the Bronze Age world for that matter. So in other words, they depended on themselves, and so when there was a time of struggle, they just continued depending on themselves, and their society, their civilization didn't collapse. And so I think that the Hebrews were probably similar to that model, although that could be somewhat off. I think it's more useful to think of them as they were very materially and culturally related to the Canaanites of the cities, the Phoenicians, that were lower, literally in altitude, closer to the Mediterranean Sea. And so when the Bronze Age collapse happened, I think that by natural occurrences, they were able to retain their version of civilization, and they were able to become at least a power in the area enough to establish the kingdom of Israel and Judah. And I think that while I don't believe that the Exodus, as according to the Bible, happened, I think it's possible that a group of people returned to Canaan from Egypt, maybe a large group of a couple of thousand of them. And I think the example of the tribe of Levi, as I mentioned before, with Egyptian-sounding names, I think it's entirely possible that when they came back from having been closer to the center of civilization that Egypt would have been, they would have been viewed to have maybe a more educated worldview, and they probably would have, while people would have been somewhat skeptical of their urbanized and civilized ways, I also think that they could have influenced things like the shape of the religion of the Israelites a little bit more. So I think that part of the Exodus story probably makes sense, but certainly not that all the Canaanites came, and certainly not that they violently conquered Canaan and that they were outsiders. I think that they were probably a mishmash of what was left after the cities crumbled themselves. And maybe they didn't even violently crumble, as some of the cities don't have burn layers or sack layers. I think that maybe just their version of civilization slowly deteriorated away, and people went to where things were still in order, and I think that would have been up in the hill country. And finally, I think the concept of David and the concept of God having his chosen dynasty, I think that that's not supportable. And I think that what really makes more sense is that as other portions of the Hebrew world collapsed, either due to the Assyrians or the growth of some cities like Jerusalem over others, I think that you have people writing historical annals, which, by the way, historical annals in the ancient Middle East were religious annals, because a king didn't just do something. A king did something because the god of that king, be it Ashur in Assyria or Marduk for Babylon, the god told the king what to do. So if a king had success, it was because their god blessed them and wanted them to conquer the city. And if they didn't, it's because the god, for whatever reason, chose to humble them or withdrew his support of the king because the king had committed some sort of sin. So I think that what we read as scripture from the Old Testament is really just the equivalent of ancient Middle Eastern historical annals, and history is written by the survivors and history is written by the winners. And I think that there was a vested interest in the people who came to power the latest on the scene, and that was the southern kingdom of Judah, which was left after Israel was captured and taken off to Assyria. And I think that they had an interest in saying and controlling the method of worship. I think that they had an economic reason for saying, hey, the only place you can worship is in the temple in Jerusalem. So if you want to have your sins forgiven, and who doesn't, then you have to come to Israel, or you have to come to Jerusalem, and you have to have your sins forgiven by our priest at this one temple. And that's not unlike, state boards of travel today that try to get people to come visit their state and come visit their, Mount Rushmore, or come visit Disney World in Florida, or whatever it is. It was literally, we want the money of pilgrims coming to get absolution for their sins. And so I think that that's why you have the cult of Yahweh. I think that's why you have the historical annals being written in such a way that glorify the place of Jerusalem, because Jerusalem's the one that lasted the longest. When actually historical records indicate that Israel was probably the much more powerful kingdom. But if you read the Old Testament, you wouldn't get that image or that picture. You would get the idea that Israel was full of rebels who didn't want to continue to worship God, at least not the way they were supposed to. So again, the purpose of this video is not to attack the Old Testament. It's really more to say you can't believe that, or you shouldn't believe that the archaeological record wholeheartedly supports the version of history that's given in the Old Testament. And it's to give you kind of a starting point, an overall thematic starting point for maybe understanding maybe what really happened versus what the Old Testament says happened. And then it also gives a little bit of a reason why that might be the case, that they would claim some things that aren't necessarily true. I think it was for political reasons. It was to claim the dominance of one kingdom over the other, or the religious superiority of one kingdom over the other. And it's to give you a starting point to go out and do your own research. And just something I think to think about. If you're the kind of person that's watching this video, then you want to know what is out there, even if it's just to refute it or argue against it. At least you take it and you digest it and you think about it, and you either better understand why you don't believe me, or if you already had questions of your own, you're hearing support for having those questions in the first place, and it gives you a good point to start to do your own studies and excavations through what's left of the archaeological record. So thank you very much for watching.